Hey everybody, lesson 3 here, chapter 9, and what we're taking a look at is how President Hoover is going to get Americans back to work. Now remember, President Hoover had been elected very late in the 1920s. He was elected in 1928, and he's going to serve until 1932, and he wants to get Americans back to work. Remember what we talked about in yesterday's video was how many Americans were out of work. Almost 25% of Americans were out of work by 1932. So he needs to find a way for people to kind of get back to a job they can do. And he thinks that public works, and you can see that definition right here, I'll highlight it for you. Public works, building projects like libraries and hospitals and schools. He thinks these are the way to go because you can put together large amounts of people.
Please report to the main office.
And it does not require any additional skill, right? You don't necessarily need skill to use a shovel. So he wants to put people to work building these gigantic projects around the country. And one of them you probably have heard of, it's called the Hoover Dam. It's the largest dam in America. It's the picture I just put right down there. Those are the kinds of things he wants people to build. And so to do this, he needs money, right? It costs money to build things. And you can get money from one of two places, right? You can either raise taxes and collect more money from the people that live in your country, or you can take out loans or credit or debt of some kind from a bank. You can borrow that money from someone that already has it and then pay it back with interest. There's a problem with both of these things, though, if you think about it, right? A problem with both taxes and with taking out loans. If you use taxes, that's less money in the pockets of the average person for them to spend on goods. And you know what we said about a supply side system. You need people to spend in order for that system to work. If you take out loans, then there's less money for banks to give to businesses that need to make money. So really what we're seeing here is no good solution, at least as far as Hoover is concerned, for building these different public works. Ultimately, he's going to choose to borrow money in order to make that happen, because what he needs to do is find a way to get Americans back to work more than anything else. So, how is he going to do this? How is he going to help America and rescue businesses and banks? He's going to create something called the National Credit Corporation. And the idea here is that if we can help banks, then banks should be able to lend money inside their communities to the people that are in need of loans, people that want to buy a home or start a business or something like that. Let me show you how it works. Typically, people would give money to their banks, savings deposits, and then banks give money out in loans. But remember, we had all of those bank runs, so people were nervous about giving banks money. So the banks need that money from somewhere. So Hoover creates the National Credit Corporation, and it gives banks the money. And it says to the banks, now you can't give this money to speculators. You can't give this money to risky investments. You have to take the same money and you have to give it to communities. And communities have to benefit from the money we give you. Now, why doesn't the National Credit Corporation just give the money themselves to communities? Well, Hoover doesn't think that Washington, D.C. knows enough about what's going on in a little town like Manchester, PA. The federal government in Washington, D.C. here doesn't know who needs a loan and who isn't. It doesn't know which person's a good investment and which isn't. But your local bank knows. They can do the research. So if we give the money to the banks instead, then ideally they can give it out to the communities. And he's going to do the same exact thing when it comes to businesses that need money. He creates the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, And its original purpose was to give loans to businesses because the businesses need that money to make investments, hire workers, produce new products, take chances, etc. So, and again, it's the same concept, right? Here we have the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and well, along comes that money that Hoover borrows to pay for these things, and it gives that to the banks, and then it makes these loans to businesses. That's the idea, right? So its initial purpose is to make loans to businesses. So we see Hoover here trying to help banks, trying to help businesses with the money that they need. But the problem is, both of these efforts fail because not enough money was given to them to lend out and to keep themselves afloat. Here's what I mean. This little chart shows how much money was in our economy. And you can see that there's a good bit of money in our economy, but then when the stock market crash happens, down it goes. And so you can see, even as Hoover is trying to give banks and businesses money, it's just not working. Sorry about that, had to get the phone. Anyway, so you can see that Hoover is trying to get money into the economy, but it's not enough for those businesses and those people to get back in shape. So, Hoover then is going to try and rescue the people. If he can't rescue the banks, if he can't rescue businesses, he's going to try and rescue the people. And Hoover has a problem. He doesn't want the federal government in Washington to just give money out to people willy-nilly because, again, the federal government in Washington, D.C. doesn't know who really needs those, that supply and who really doesn't. So he instead is going to work on a law called the Emergency Relief and Construction Act that is going to do things a little bit differently. What the Emergency Relief and Construction Act does a little bit differently, instead of the federal government giving money, and hold on, I got to make this bigger so that we can all see it. Whoop. Instead of the federal government in Washington, D.C., giving money directly to the American people, because in Hoover's opinion, a government in D.C., there's no way they can know who needs what, in some place like Manchester. Instead, the federal government will give that money to Pennsylvania, and then Pennsylvania can figure out who needs that money better than Washington, D.C. can. That's the idea anyway, and it does pass, and it does provide loans to the states to give direct relief of citizens. And this is a really big deal because it's the first time our government in Washington, D.C. ever provides money for direct relief. It had done things like, okay, well, we'll give money for public works to give people a job, and then the job will pay the people. But you always had to do something for it. Or maybe it gave money for housing or for bread lines or soup kitchens. But it never just gave people money. But now, Emergency Relief and Construction Act does that. It gives people money for the first time.
Good morning, Northeastern. Today is Cycle Day 2. At this time, would everyone please rise and pledge allegiance to our country's flag, and those of you in the hallways, please pause.
But it's not enough, and people are still suffering. You're starving. So these next few slides will take a look at how people respond to Hoover's efforts, which, while he does try to help banks and businesses, and he does try to help the people, it's just not enough. For example, people are going to go on what's called hunger marches, because they're literally starving, and they're so upset. So tens of thousands of people will be marching with the Communist Party, right? You get communism, right? Just 10 years prior in the 1920s, we'd been going through a Red Scare. And now, 10 years later, you've got tens of thousands of Americans rioting, breaking into grocery stores, protesting with the communists because they feel like their government is failing them. Farmers are destroying their own crops in protest because no one's buying, and lenders are taking their property, they're foreclosing on their homes and on their land. It's a gigantic mess. Even veterans are upset. Veterans from World War I. Now, the way this works is back in 1917, veterans were promised a $1,000 bonus check in 1945. Now, the way that works is supposed to be kind of something like this. In 1917, on the left, I'm going to highlight it here in blue, I volunteered to fight in World War I. And all this time later, in 1945, you're going to give me $1,000 for fighting. But something happens in the meantime, and I'll circle that in green. The Great Depression happens in 1932. It's a good 13 years before I'm supposed to get my $1,000, but I need that money now. I need that money now. So I understand that I went to fight that war in 1917. I understand that you promised me $1,000 in 1945, but I need that now in 1932. So we have 15,000 veterans, people that fought for our country, were wounded for our country. They go to D.C. and they camp out in Hoovervilles in the city. And they become known as the bonus marchers because they're marching to Washington to get their bonus early. And they demand their money. And President Hoover says no. He refuses. And he says, I want those camps cleared. And the bonus marchers refuse to leave. You can see a photograph here next to my head of the police panicking as they're trying to kick bonus marchers, World War I veterans, guys with freaking canes. You can see this guy with a cane, for heaven's sake. One of them is shot and killed. 2 veterans are killed. The police are pulled back, and Hoover sends in the Army. The U.S. Army of 1932 expels the veterans from World War I. With tear gas and bayonets. They charge in on horses. It's unbelievable. The Army charges the Army. The press coverage, you can imagine, harms Hoover so much as he was trying to get reelected that people really are upset with him. I mean, why would we reelect a guy who can't help banks, who can't help businesses, can't help people, can't help farmers? Why would we reelect him, especially when he goes after the veterans? People think that he failed to resolve the crisis, but you need to understand this. His response to the Great Depression was more than anyone had ever done before. He did more than any president had ever done before to expand the role of the government in helping the people, but it just wasn't enough to stop the Great Depression. So he lost in a landslide to a guy named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR. And we'll talk more about him coming up in the next chapter.